Hello, I'm Michael Pierce, and this is The Human Condition. Today we're talking about brain fog. The condition of brain fog is a very nebulous term, but everybody seems to know what we're talking about when we say it. It's not always true, but most people get the idea, the very rough idea, that when you say brain fog, you mean kind of a lack of clarity, a lack of focus, a lack of concentration, maybe a mild distractibility like squirrel, that kind of idea that a person's brain is not quite up to snuff. It may also look like the person is not fully awake. Maybe they've had trouble transitioning from asleep to awake, and that feeling is also very brain foggy. A feeling of tiredness or fatigue can qualify as brain fog. So lots of people use the term brain fog, and they often feel like they have trouble seeing too, like their vision is not quite as clear, their senses are not quite as clear, perhaps their balance is not quite as good, their hearing is not as crystal clear, and they have to squint more to see and read and understand what they're reading. So brain fog is really this nebulous picture of symptoms, and generally these symptoms are brought about by a lot of biochemistry. Now they can be from concussion, and I've got other videos on concussion, so we'll save that for another video. But for this one I want to talk about the metabolic contributions to brain fog. And metabolism means what you eat and how you process it. So if you eat stuff and you process it, that's your metabolism, that's your body chemistry or your biochemistry. So if a person looks at all the different causes that could cause brain fog and why other people don't have brain fog, the single biggest reason is probably a blood sugar problem. The person has either low blood sugar or insulin resistance, and both of them can cause the same kinds of feelings, which are a lack of focus, a lack of concentration, and a brain that just doesn't seem like it's firing on all cylinders. So if a person has a low-carb diet or a low-lectin diet, that can help them quite a bit. That usually means having a little more fat, a little more animal products, a little more meat, a little more of these things that are not grains, not beans, not seeds, and not nuts. Even though those are considered healthy foods in many forums, they can be a problem for certain people, and it depends on who you are. Not everybody is sensitive to the same foods and the same sugars. Another possibility is cooked food versus raw food. There are a number of people that do raw food diets in order to cleanse, and that can work very well for people for a short period of time or a longer period of time. However, there are a number of people that have to do cooked food at some point because they just can't digest and get the nutrients they need from the raw food. And that happens to individuals, and you often don't know who you are until you try it. My biggest guideline would come from Robert Lustig, which is the concept of no processed food. If you've got brain fog and you're eating processed food, get rid of it. Get rid of the processed food, get rid of the stuff that comes in a box. Go back to basic real food that is either grown from the earth and it's right there and you chop it up yourself, or it's a meat or a flesh or some kind of a bone that you cook into a stew or a soup or something. So getting rid of processed food is more important than whether you're ketogenic or carnivore or vegan. I don't care about what kind of diet you choose as long as you get rid of the processed food, and Robert Lustig really makes a great case for that as a professor of endocrinology. Pediatric endocrinology is what he does. We also use the herbs turmeric, boswellia, and resveratrol. I use these herbs quite often with people that have brain fog or brain inflammation of any kind, even from concussion. Now, this is a bit controversial because the carnivore folks, of which I am one in many ways, talk about how you really shouldn't use herbs. And I have to say that if a person hasn't decided to go whole hog, no pun intended, carnivore, they can benefit from symptomatic relief of inflammation from turmeric, boswellia, and resveratrol. These are herbs that work very nicely for reducing inflammation in somebody that hasn't decided to go off of all the plants. It does cause benefit, and it does help people get a lot better after they've been eating a lot of processed food and a lot of grains and lectins and sugars and plant-based foods. They can do quite well with these. Now, eventually, the ideal would be that you wouldn't need any of those herbs and you would just be able to eat a healthy diet. But it takes a while to get there, and if you're new to it, sometimes a carnivore or ketogenic diet is just too much for you to try, or it might be too much for your doctor or your family to understand, or for you to understand. So, you work your way up to that kind of thing, and I've found it to be very, very useful. Are there some whiplash effects to turmeric? Are there some problems with all plant-based and herb-based medicines? Well, sure. And those have to do with anti-nutrients and defensins that are in plants that defend them from animals eating them. And I think you can watch Paul Saladino about that. He does a great job explaining those things better than I. Omega-3s are extremely important. We need to make sure that we get sources of omega-3s, omega-3 fats, because usually the omega-6 oils are highly inflammatory and they mess up your insulin processing. So if you were just to have a lot of omega-6 and not enough omega-3, that alone, that imbalance in oils, that ratio between 6 and 3 is enough to give you insulin resistance and improper processing of your sugars. Another thing that will cause improper processing of sugars is lack of protein and lack of all the amino acids. So that's very important for people to get a good animal source of protein if they can. And if they can't, you can combine beans and grains, but to get a complete protein, but you're going to have lots of lectin problems and you're going to have some sugar problems to deal with if you do that. But you can achieve that, especially if it's more whole and unprocessed. The danger with that whole and unprocessed grains and beans is that you'll have more lectins. The more processed a product is, the less lectins there usually are, but the processing is horrible for you too. So, either way, the more raw it is, the more lectins, the more processed it is, the more chemicals, and the less lectins. So either way, it doesn't work very well for me personally. So I tend to avoid those things, beans and grains. You really want to avoid seed oils. The sunflower, the safflower, the corn oil, the palm oil, these are not great. Coconut is much better, and of course the animal fats are much better. Butter is good, ghee. If you eat dairy products, whole, full fat cream, these are good sources of saturated fats. You need good saturated fats and not all those processed seed oils. I don't know if you know this, but the processed seed oils are so awful that they have to be deodorized, because the process of collecting those oils is so awful that they have to be deodorized and they have to be dealt with because of the oxidation and the terrible smell that these oils give off when you try to squeeze the oils from those seeds. It's just not a very appetizing thing, and it's not very good for you. The other thing for brain fog is to make sure you have good sleep. If you don't have good sleep hygiene, you're going to have brain fog. And so that means sleep hygiene doesn't mean taking a bath before bed, although that's nice too. Sleep hygiene means taking care of all the triggers of sleep, making sure you get rid of blue light after, say, 5 p.m. Try to turn off your blue light sources in your eyes so you don't have a lot of blue light bombarding your brainstem before you go to sleep, and of course at night. Getting rid of light sources in the room, trying to have the room as dark as possible and then as light as possible during the day or during the morning, which is hard to do because, if you want to go to sleep with a dark room and you want to wake up with the sunshine, you almost have to have your shades on a timer so they open automatically before you wake up to let the light in. I've also had people and myself use a light-based alarm clock instead of a sound-based alarm clock, where the alarm clock simply just turns on a light very slowly and gently, and it's a warm yellow-toned light that just gets brighter and brighter and brighter, and that wakes you up sometimes. So if you've got to go to work, don't rely on that because you might just sleep through your alarm. But you can learn to use a light-based alarm clock instead of a sound-based alarm clock to wake up and get your rhythms back. Don't eat a lot of sugary foods before bed. You might do well with eating a fatty meal before bed to help you sleep, but not a sugary meal before bed. Ideally, you wouldn't want to eat anything before bed, but if you had to eat something, better to eat something fatty than something sugary for sleep. Now, if you're doing weight loss concerns, that's a whole nother lecture. I find a lot of people do poorly with dairy products because of the mucus production. A number of my patients, including me, get a lot of swollen sinuses and ears and itchy ears and swollen sinuses in the maxillary sinuses, and in the back here, there's sinuses back here in your head called mastoid air sinuses. And then there's your actual sinuses inside your nose that swell. There's 3 different shelves inside your nose. If you could take off a person's face and look at their nose, you'd see 3 shelves called the turbinates. And the turbinates are these things of tissue that can swell up and fill your sinuses and then reduce. And a lot of people think they have a deviated septum, and all they really do is have swollen turbinates and blocked turbinates. So I find that when you consume foods that cause mucus production, like grain and dairy and processed foods and sugars, you're going to get swollen sinuses and you're going to have breathing problems and you're going to have obstructive sleep apnea. And when you get rid of those foods and you give yourself time, a few weeks, to get rid of all that inflammation, you do quite a bit better. Now, I'm not a big fan of nasal sprays that are chemical-based and drug-based because they just treat the symptom. They don't treat the cause. And the cause is usually those irritating sugars and proteins and fats that are causing inflammation in those sinuses. So getting rid of the cause is the real idea, the root cause. I find magnesium is very useful for brain fog, just generally. 50% of Americans don't get the RDA for magnesium, which is horrible because it's a pretty low number. So we really need to make sure that people are getting magnesium. And then we need to look at the idea of should you eat more often or less often. And I'm going to say yes, it depends on you. Some people find that they have to eat every hour and a half. And that's because these people are fundamentally hypoglycemic. That means they have low blood sugar. And if they don't eat every hour and a half, they get really low blood sugary and they can't handle it. And they get a sympathetic response. They get a response where their body's sympathetic nervous system just makes them feel jittery and nervous, and they mobilize cortisol from their adrenal glands, and that allows them to mobilize blood sugar from their liver and release the sugar from their liver so that they can use it in their blood. And that's because they fundamentally have unstable blood sugar, and that usually comes from omega-3 deficiency, multi-mineral trace mineral deficiency, and macromineral deficiency, and protein deficiency. So that's why the person craves the sugar. What they really need is fats and proteins and minerals, and that's what will give them more stable cells and more stable blood sugar. Because the stability of the electrical field of cells is based on what's inside the cell. And that means you need negative proteins, negatively charged proteins, and positive and negatively charged minerals. Those are the two things that make a cell very strong and able to have good membranes and good insulin receptors and the ability to go a long time, like to be able to fast. So those people are the people that can fast for hours or days and not feel unstable mentally. They don't have brain fog because they don't have that hypoglycemia. On the other hand, some people have increased insulin resistance, which means high blood sugar, pre-diabetes or diabetes type 2, and they have kind of the opposite problem. They've got too much blood sugar, and they do really well from fasting, and they also do well from getting a low-carb diet, a diet that has much more omega-3 fats, much more protein, not much more protein, but more fats, more saturated fats, more omega-3s, maybe more high-quality protein, and less of the lectins and less of the sugars. That'll help a person with brain fog if they have insulin resistance. The general idea to give them minerals and to give them a better diet. So that's brain fog for you, very briefly.